Hello everyone. In this episode, I am going to be talking about art. More specifically, a certain artist with a particular art style. Let me introduce you to Hans Siebert von Heister. I'm guessing that's how his name is pronounced. He was a German painter. He was born in Dusseldorf in the year 1888 and died in Berlin in the year 1967. Very little is known about him and his art, so therefore I want to shed some light on him because I believe he deserves some recognition for the contribution he has made for this world. Let's honor this artist by giving him the publicity he deserves. Even though Renaissance paintings are among my favorite kinds of art, I can't help but feel fascinated by Expressionism. In order for us to understand Heister, we need to understand what Expressionism is. I'll cover this as briefly as possible in order to understand the historical context behind it. Expressionism is purely about expressing intense emotion instead of creating paintings that look realistic. The most common characteristics of Expressionism is the use of bold colors, distorted forms, and exaggerations. These are used to convey intense emotions and psychological states. It's the opposite of naturalism that depicts nature or anything that is realistic. This art style emerged around early 20th century when Expressionist artists had no interest in depicting physical reality. It peaked around the 1920s. One prime example of Expressionist art is the world-famous Scream painting by Edvard Munch. Based on my research, Expressionism comes in the form of literature, theatre, film, architecture, and music as well as art. To give you some examples of Expressionist work, I recommend you check out movies like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, released in the year 1920. With artistic angular backdrops, I think this is the best example of Expressionism on film. I'll put the link in the description for that, if you want to watch it. Expressionist architecture, such as the Shell House in Berlin, resembles what would later become Art Deco in the 1930s. One good example of Expressionist music is Pierrot Lunaire, released in 1912 by Arnold Schoenberg. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'll put the link in the description for that too. Now, you may be wondering, why does all this Expressionist art seem to come with German-sounding names? As I mentioned earlier, Expressionism peaked in the 1920s in order to cope with the trauma of the First World War. Germany was going through massive cultural changes at the time. While people lived through economic instability and rapid urbanization, this gave a sense of disillusionment and an existential crisis, thus creating a new generation of artists and intellectuals. So, where does Heister come into all this? Now that we have briefly covered what Expressionism is and the historical context, let's take a look at his life. Heister began studying painting in the year 1911, which means he would have been 23 years old at the time. I wasn't able to find anything about his earlier life or childhood. He was a student of Lovis Corinth, who was a German Impressionist painter. Impressionism is something I covered in a previous video on why we love art and music. I talked about Monet and Van Gogh and the difference between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. In this case, Lovis Corinth was the German equivalent of Monet, with his emphasis on brushstrokes, light, and portraits. Heister was also a student of Konrad von Kardorff, another German Impressionist painter. Von Kardorff mainly created portraits, but also floral paintings and landscapes. He also painted Berlin street views. Lovis Corinth focused more on portraits and still life. When we look at the artwork of these two artists, we can see how they influenced Heister, particularly with their styles of brushstrokes and bold colors. In 1919, Heister joined a group called the Young Rhineland, which is an association of young artists. Its movement was characterized by its rejection of academic traditions and its embrace of Expressionist art style. They wanted to break away from established norms and embrace new forms of artistic expression. This group of artists wanted to challenge conventional artistic styles and explore innovative approaches to art. In short, They were youths rebelling against conventional art, such as realistic-looking natural art possibly. He later joined the November Group, which is another group of artists rebelling against traditional art. The group's activities included organizing exhibitions, lectures, and performances to showcase the work of its members and other contemporary artists. They also published a magazine called Die Aktion, which served as a platform for disseminating their ideas and promoting their artistic endeavors. The November Group was a diverse organization comprising of artists from various artistic movements and backgrounds, including Expressionism and Dadaism, to name a few. Despite their diverse perspectives, members of the November Group shared a commitment to artistic innovation, social engagement, and cultural exchange. The artists in the November Group described themselves as radical revolutionaries. Exhibitions were regularly organized as the most important means of self-expression. Every year, the members of the artist group were represented at the Great Berlin Art Exhibition with their own November Group room. In 1921, Heister became a journalist before he became a co-founder of the German Broadcasting Corporation. In 1922, Heister made a painting called Weib, which translates to wife in German, but I can't find it. It was then purchased by the Düsseldorf Municipal Art Collection in the same year. After the handover of power to Adolf Hitler in 1933, the group of artists in the November Group were forced to stop their work. In 1935, the November Group came to an end. It was sealed with its deletion from the city's Register of Associations. Heister's painting was among the many art the Nazis confiscated. It was then displayed at the Degenerate Art Exhibition in Munich in 1937. Even though the Nazi definition of the word was vague, the Degenerate Art Exhibition was a propaganda by the Nazis to teach the public what bad art was. As far as they were concerned, these new art styles did not align with their values. This exhibition was a public mockery of such art styles as Expressionism, which they perceived as degenerate, lowly art. The exhibition was part of a larger effort by the Nazi regime to purify German culture and promote art that aligned with their values. Among the artwork displayed included some of his mentor's work, Lovis Corinth. During the Third Reich, Corinth's work was condemned by the Nazis as degenerate art. So in 1937, Nazi authorities removed 295 of his works from public collections and transported 7 of them to Munich, where they were displayed in March of 1937 in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. To add insult to injury, this happened after Corinth died in 1925. So, instead of censoring the art the Nazis did not like, they simply stole them, only to put them on display to tell the German people that this is bad art. As a side note, Adolf Hitler himself was a painter before he got into politics. Maybe he had a deep resentment for other artists' recognition because he was rejected. The exhibition was carefully staged to encourage the public to mock the work, and it became one of the most infamous exhibitions of the 20th century. Imagine having your artwork confiscated by a political party only to be put on display to be publicly tarnished as bad art. Imagine how Heister must have felt about his creation being demonized along with his friends and mentor and their artwork. From 1924 to 1940, he was the editor-in-chief of the Deutsche Rundfunk Funkpost, which was a German radio broadcasting corporation. Think of it as the German equivalent of the British Broadcast Corporation, or as the BBC for short. During the Second World War, in 1942, at the height of German expansion, Heister was the editor of the programmatic text National Economic Order and Greater Area Economy for the Society for European Economic Planning and Greater Area Economy. Yeah, the Germans were very good at naming things back then. After the war, Heister worked as a freelance painter and writer, but there is very little to no trace of his work. I cannot find any art he created after the Second World War, nor am I able to find any of his writings or any records of his radio broadcasts. Why is that, you may ask? After the British defeated Germany, the British occupiers found countless records from the Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft, the RRG for short, which was just another name for the German Broadcast Corporation, ranging from 1933 to 1945, of which they considered between 8,000 and 9,000 to be politically and historically important, and handed them over to the BBC in London in 1945. So basically, the British Army confiscated radio recordings of Nazi propaganda from 1933 to 1945, got German prisoners to translate them, only to lock them away in the British Library. To this day, based on what I've seen, no one in the public can access them. When you go to the British Library catalogue, there is no audio content available. To prove my point, I'll put the link to that page here. When I type Heister's name, the British Library catalogue shows nothing. It's as if all his work has been erased. In short, Heister has been censored twice in his life, first by the German government and then by the British government. But this raises another question. What happened to the Expressionist artists after the Second World War? One of the things that happened to them was immigration and exile. Many German Expressionist artists, particularly those who were persecuted by the Nazi regime, emigrated from Germany during or after the war. Some went to other European countries such as Switzerland or France, while others sought refuge in the United States. For example, artists like Max Beckmann and George Gross fled to the United States. The second possibility is reintegration. Some German Expressionist painters who remained in Germany after the war were persecuted and stigmatized for their work. This is what I think most likely happened to Heister, because there is no record of him ever leaving Germany after the war. After all, he did die in Berlin. The third possibility is continuation. Despite the upheaval caused by the war, many German Expressionist painters continued to create art. Artists such as Emil Nolde and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner went back to their original themes and styles. Some people say that the other artists explored new directions or changed their styles to reflect post-war realities. I didn't look into these artists, for they are not the subject of this video. When all this comes together, Hans Siebert von Heister stayed in Germany after the war, became a freelance writer and artist. But then again, there are no traces of his work after the war. No record of his writings, no paintings. It would have been interesting to see some of his later paintings to compare with his pre-war paintings to see if there were any changes in his art style. Given that Heister died in 1967 in Berlin, he must have kept a low profile because of the humiliation he went through before and after the war. So where do we go from here? Let's take a look at what remains of Heister's work. By looking at his artwork, we can only guess the kind of person he was. The first paintings I present are Ekstatische Figur, 1919, which means ecstatic figure. He has made two of these paintings in the same year. One depicts a naked man, the other depicts a naked woman. He painted the figures with angular shapes, with a combination of cool colors and warm colors. Maybe this is his way of showing how we humans can be warm to some people and cold to others. At least, that's my interpretation of them. The next painting is Andacht, 1919, which means devotion. Here in this painting, we see a man, a woman, and a child. I can see houses in the background. The green shapes are most likely to be trees. The man is holding a stick. We can tell the figure in blue is a woman because she is holding the baby with what looks like a halo around its head. Is this meant to be some kind of Christian artwork? If it is, then maybe this is his way of expressing his Christian faith. The painting is called Devotion. Devotion to what? To God? To family? Or I'm guessing what he really wants is to be a father to provide for a wife and child. The next painting is Ekstase, 1919, which means ecstasy. Here he has painted three naked male figures in different positions with straight lines. All the figures are angular and no curves. All the shapes are triangular, a mixture of dark and light colors within each shape. Why would he call this painting ecstasy? I don't know. However, this is one of his paintings that stand out from the rest. He must have felt strongly about this one. The next painting is Drei Frauen, 1919 to 1920, which means three women. Here we have three women, naked. Unlike the ecstasy painting, we have organic lines. There cannot be women without curves. There is a mixture of cold colors as well as warm colors. He seems to love women very much. Instead of making them look realistic, he depicts them like a dream. The next painting is Drei Männer. The date of this painting is unknown, but it means three men. Once again, he paints three figures, all men, but this time he uses bright colors. All the warm and cold colors clash with one another. Oddly enough, he depicts them quite effeminately, as if they have triangular breasts like women. The next painting is Familie, 1920, which means family. Again, there is a man, a woman, and a child. This time they are all naked, with warm colors. Why would he do that? Perhaps he craves the intimacy. Maybe he cherishes the innocence of the family. Maybe this is the sort of thing he truly desired. The next painting, Der Gipfel, 1922, which means the summit. This one is completely abstract. There are no figures, only shapes. Some round, others straight. The color scheme is warm. Maybe this is his way of conveying the warmth he felt when he was surrounded by his peers during the meetings, such as the groups he joined. The next painting is Grün Wogge, 1921, which means green wave. This for me is the weirdest of them all. What we are seeing here are two figures looking almost abstract. You can see the stick-like arms and hands, as if there is a man and a woman dancing. The next painting is Embryo, 1921, which means, of course, embryo. Obviously, this resembles an embryo. I'm not sure what to make of this one. I really don't. Is this a statement on anti-abortion, or is he trying to show us life before birth? Maybe he's trying to depict the value of life. Finally, the one painting I want to conclude with is this one, my favorite of them all. I'll call this one unknown because I can't find its name anywhere, and neither can I find out what year it was painted. This is what got me interested in Heister in the first place. The painting I'm referring to here is that there is a woman lying on a man's lap. His head is turning away from her, and yet he gently touches her with his hand. Maybe this is his way of telling us that he wants love. He doesn't know how to treat a woman or how to make love, possibly indicating that he is a virgin. Despite the lines going in so many different angles, the whole thing feels gentle. Maybe he craved intimacy. I like the choice of colors and how they have different tones that blend into one another. I like this interpretation of drapery and human anatomy. When all this comes together, Heister was an interesting character. He was a loving, affectionate person who dreamed of warmth. He must have been a friendly person who idolized human anatomy in a different way. Maybe all he wanted was to live in a world of peace and love, after what he lived through, where everyone was treated fairly, unlike the treatment he got in real life, perhaps. I don't think he was poor or working class, otherwise I don't think he would have been able to afford to study with some of the greatest artists at the time. However, we don't know if he had any brothers or sisters. Perhaps he was alone. Maybe his artist friends were the only people where he felt he belonged with. But here are some questions that come to mind. Why did he choose Expressionism as an art style? Why did he feel the need to rebel against traditional art? Perhaps he believed he wasn't as good as the traditional artists he was competing against. Maybe this gave him a sense of self-loathing that grew into jealousy and envy of other artists he thought that were better than himself. If you compare the art of the Third Reich to the Expressionist paintings, there is a huge difference. The Nazi regime wanted to build a new Germany based on ideals inspired by the ancient Greeks. They wanted to replicate the perfection of the human anatomy, similar to what you see in Renaissance paintings. Perhaps this mentality created a form of elitism against artists who were not so good, so maybe they were cast out. After all, it is natural for young people to be rebellious. So maybe this is why he turned to Expressionism to fight back against the upper-class artists. Since his masters were Impressionist painters, they too must have received discrimination. Perhaps Heister felt that his masters, who he maybe he possibly viewed as his mentors as father figures were being attacked for their style by snobbish artists who viewed themselves as superior artists. Now there's a possibility. There is also no record of him engaging in combat. There are many men who refuse to fight wars. One reason is because they don't agree with their country's government's foreign policies. Maybe his views did not align with the dominant government at the time. Who knows? Once the Nazis took hold of power in 1933, Heister must have been forced to change his writings and his broadcast. After all, he was the editor-in-chief of the German Broadcast Corporation at the time. The Nazi regime is well known for its propaganda and language policing. Heister must have been forced to submit to the politics he didn't agree with. First, the Nazis confiscate his paintings to get the public to mock them, only to force him to broadcast their politics on the radio station that he created. Heister had no choice but to comply, otherwise he would have been arrested and thrown in jail for treachery or wrongthink. This must have been embarrassing for him. He watched his country be defeated by war twice. He was forced to become a political puppet for a government he despised, only to scavenge for leftovers of whatever he can find and live on the debris left over by the war. Maybe he spent the rest of his life alone because he was scared that he was going to be separated from all his friends again. He was once with a group of artists who he shared similar views with, only to be disbanded by the force, by the government, only to watch the rest of the world crumble. Perhaps after the war, he was scared that all this would happen again. It would be no surprise if he became a recluse to spare himself the pain of stigmatization and humiliation. How did he get by from the year 1945 when the war ended until he died in 1967? That is 22 years apart. He died at the age of 79. Did he live in poverty? He must have had very little income after the war. On top of that, living with shame and guilt from the war, along with the grief of lost friends and loved ones. We can only guess by looking at his artwork. May he rest in peace, knowing that his efforts had not gone to waste. As long as we remember him and his artwork, he will never be alone nor forgotten. Although what we know about him is tragic, his childhood and his later life is a mystery. I came across Heister while I was doing my Art AVCE Double Award in secondary school, and when I saw his artwork, there was something about it that spoke to me. I didn't get around to doing research on him until recently. I'm glad I did. Now we know more about an artist who is pretty much unknown. I hope this does him the justice he deserves. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been enlightening for you. Do you have an artist you find fascinating? If so, please tell me your thoughts in the comment section below and why. Or, if there is an artist you'd like me to cover, please tell me in the comment section or contact me via any of my social media profiles in the video description. Take good care of yourselves.